On the divestiture side, I think business leaders, right, they're thinking about ways to reduce the risk for buyers. What can they do with an asset as they bring it to market to reduce the friction and make it more attractive? And even if a divestiture is not imminent, right, companies can reduce future risks as they move through those internal reorganizations that align their businesses, create the opportunity to divest, or relieve or create the opportunity for business units to really drive better returns on the capital they're allocated. The portfolio review can reveal opportunities for divestitures, right? That can free up capital, reallocate capital, and even if it's not to M&A, to other areas of investment to drive that growth agenda. This study we have coming out, the power of portfolio renewal and the value in divestitures, right? So the volume of acquisitions has been outpacing divestitures in recent years. So why are so many companies reluctant to divest? Right, to help answer that question, PwC conducted a research study to examine the decision maker's journey and the value in divestitures, including portfolio renew, divestiture execution, and reinvestment. Right, many forces combine to dissuade executives from divestitures, burning up precious value-creating time. So our study explores a wide range of internal and external influences impacting the speed and effectiveness of portfolio decisions and divestitures. And our research also uncovered elements that have the greatest impact on decision-making and seller returns. So we're excited to delve deeper into the study with you today. To do so, we've invited a number of our partners and specialists to discuss the study's insights. But before they join us, we'd also like to start with a short video.
Your business is alive, and it thrives when you constantly evaluate and evolve it. In order for your business to grow, sometimes you must let something go. Making your business stronger requires you to take action. But how do you spot the right moment to change? How do you break out of the status quo and make that winning move? It's not easy. You have to break the stigma of divestitures. It takes overcoming the headache and heartache of handing over a piece of your business to its best owner so you can secure your business's future. Portfolio renewal seizes opportunities to gain a competitive edge. Proactively managing your portfolio rejuvenates your business and refreshes your capital, making your organization stronger. Move, renew, grow. It's the power in divesting.
I'd like to welcome Kurt Moldenauer to the studio. Kurt's a retired partner and an adjunct faculty at St. Mary's College of California. And Kurt's actually been involved from the inception of this research, bringing both the business acumen and research mindset that's enabled us to derive these findings. So we're going to cover a variety of topics from the study. Kurt, thanks for being here.
Happy to be here, John. Thanks.
No, it's great to see you again. So divestitures are a relatively well-researched area, and I think many executives would assume that most of the significant questions, they've been answered. But we continue to notice, divestitures do not feature as prominently in our conversations with clients as we might expect. Acquisitions are enthusiastically discussed, but divestitures often surface more reluctantly. This is definitely curious because we know from previous research that on average, divestitures create value for shareholders.
Yeah, John, in 2021, 50% of the firms in the Fortune 500 executed an acquisition. Only 20% did a divestiture. Now, that might be a natural consequence of a growing firm expanding its boundaries faster than it contracts. But as you suggest, our continued conversations with clients suggest there's something more going on there, an actual degree of reluctance. And we were curious to understand why that was. So we asked three basic research questions. First, what are the drivers or the influences behind this divestiture reluctance? Second, does it matter? Are there consequences to reluctance? And third, are there things that firms can do to help mitigate that level of reluctance? Rather uniquely, in order to address what we feel is a gap in the research, both from an academic and a practitioner perspective, we look at the divestiture decision-making process itself, including the attributes of individual decision makers, as well as the decision-making context.
Well, so in order to address these questions, right, we uniquely used a variety of methods, a combination of analysis of archival data, interviews of executives, one of the most extensive divestiture surveys ever fielded. The team developed multiple statistical models to analyze the data in an unbiased manner. So one of the key findings of that survey is that 2/5 of respondents stated their company embraces divestitures, which confirms our hypothesis that firms are reluctant on average to divest?
Yeah, the research did suggest two distinct personas with respect to divestitures. Those firms that actively embrace divestitures and those that are a little more reluctant to do so. Management from firms that actively embrace divestitures actively promote divestitures as a strategic action. For these firms, divestitures are embedded in their strategic decision-making processes. They're embedded as part of the corporate culture. For the reluctant divestors, the attitudes ranged from indifference to outright resistance. Now, you might ask why that matters. Well, the academic research on this point is very clear. Attitudes are important with respect to effective decision-making. Attitudes towards strategic change in particular are an indication of management's receptivity towards the change, as well as their readiness to embrace the change. Negative attitudes towards a strategic change as big as a divestiture, therefore, can lead to management being inactive.
Well, taking this to the consequences, right? We established that divestitures create value, well established in the research. So now this research addresses whether the reluctance has consequences on that value creation, right? Focusing on the timeliness of decision-making. Specifically, do delays in decision-making adversely impact firm value creation? And then what are the elements impacting that decision-making?
Yeah, it was amazing to me, John, that nobody's really looked at timeliness in terms of value creation. And so again, our research method here worked well for us. We divided the process into the two main processes of a divestiture decision: portfolio review and divestiture execution. With respect to portfolio review, we focused on what we define as the fit signal, which is simply a series of factors or perceptual cues that indicate to a manager that he or she has a divestible asset. The research on this point is very clear in terms of the findings. The more proactive a firm is with respect to recognizing that fit signal, the more value they're going to create. Additionally, the firms that fully embrace divestitures use external perceptual cues, a change in the competitive environment or landscape, in order to trigger their action. Whereas the more reluctant group relies on internal contextual cues like a decline in revenue or an increase in a business unit loss.
Interesting. So let's pivot then to some of the insights we're able to identify related to biases and some of the cognitive factors impacting portfolio risk review. This is a topic you and I, we talk about, but it's not often discussed, but it's really, really important in terms of the impacts. So we saw it in the combination between the qualitative interviews and the quantitative research, right? It allowed us to identify several factors that impact timeliness of an effective portfolio review and the decision to divest. What stood out to you?
Well, very broadly in the research, we use the term inertia, which again is just a series of factors that impede organizational change. Now, these factors can be internal to the firm or external to the firm, but we chose to focus primarily on the internal ones. And the research does confirm that factors like commingled costs and corporate taxation can lead to delays in decision-making. But what's most interesting to me is the fact that individual decision-making biases can also lead to delays in decision-making. And the research suggests that one in particular, overconfidence, features very prominently. The interviews suggest several cases of where firms make repeated attempts to fix a performance issue prior to exiting that activity. Now, this suggests a feedback loop where the perceptual cues, the fit signal, is being recognized but potentially ignored, which is a behavior consistent with overconfidence. Now, this feedback loop may happen several times before the firm ultimately exits the business activity.
And we've referred to that in the study as the fit, fix, free fallacy, right? And its prevalence and the adverse impact or the value really became quite evident. So as we think about the importance of these individual divestiture decisions, right, the research also showed there are personal implications to the individual decision maker as a result of divestitures. Emotions featured significantly, both in the interviews, in terms of the impact on divestitures and the decision-making, and then perceived personal cost to decision makers, which can drive some of those negative emotions associated with divestitures.
Yeah, it's very rare that in the course of my career, I had a chance to talk about emotions with respect to decision making. Yet they feature very prominently in the research. And there were two in particular, anticipated regret and loss of prestige. Now, anticipated regret is simply the manager emotional reaction to the potential consequences to the firm's employees. Now, obviously, and this was consistent with the interviews, managers develop close emotional ties with their teams during the ordinary course of business. When a divestiture comes up, they anticipate negative potential consequences for their teams, and that impacts their decision making. Loss of prestige is a little bit different. That involves the emotional reaction to the direct personal consequences to the manager, him or herself. As we know, divestitures are very prominent strategic activities and often an admission that a previous strategy didn't work out so well. So managers absolutely weigh in the personal career consequences with respect to divestitures as an emotion.
And seeing how prevalent that came out in the certainly in the interviews and the study, I think was really interesting to acknowledge something that exists but is often really less discussed. So the results are really interesting and unique, especially as it relates to these attitudes, biases, right, the emotions, the individuals that are not covered in previous research. But in practice, I mean, how do you see executives and board members addressing some of these issues?
Well, again, the research finding on this is very clear, John. A high-quality divestiture decision process helps create value with respect to divestitures. Now, a low-quality process is one that is infrequent, lacks formality, and is ad hoc. A high-quality process, on the other hand, has a high degree of frequency, strong board governance, as well as comprehensive analysis that includes extensive scanning of the external environment. Board governance in particular allows that outside voice and the frank and open conversations that are needed in order to overcome many of these issues we've been talking about with respect to biases and emotions. Additionally, firms might consider potentially adjusting either incentives and or creating additional training in order to help improve attitudes.
As we wrap up, Kurt, I'm struck by the simple yet clear evidence that divestitures are an under-leveraged tool in the pursuit of shareholder value. And with the study addressing some of the key gaps in definitive research, right, what are some other takeaways you have?
Well, certainly your point on the under-leveraged use of divestitures is the critical one. Now, we all know that firms are facing an unstable, unclear business environment that's only starting to grapple with things like the pandemic, other social forces, and economic issues. I would suggest to you that in such an environment, growth alone is not a sufficient corporate strategic objective. Firms that don't adapt fail, ultimately. So firms need to lean in. They need to embrace the idea of strategic reconfiguration, which is enhancing those areas where they have competitive advantage, but as importantly, exiting those activities where they're not the best owner of the asset. By simply adopting good portfolio review and divestitures as a strategic tool, firms can enhance their ability to see around corners and anticipate future change.
That's great. Thank you, Kurt, for joining us today. It's great to have you here in the
Happy to do
studio. As we mentioned earlier, one of the key elements of this study was to be able to have interviews with 29 executives. We'd like to share with you some of their perspectives.
I think there is broad understanding of how acquiring assets can drive value, but I don't think it's intuitive to people about why disposing of an asset can drive value. So to support that overall divestiture mindset, people need to understand the value creation calculus. It starts with having a clear view of the intrinsic value of the assets in your portfolio. Tied to that is understanding the future growth prospects of the businesses and the resource investment needed to support the value. Helping the organization understand that selling a business for higher than its intrinsic value to a third party is a win-win and is a big unlock to creating a divestiture mindset.
Divestitures are tough, no doubt about it. But I think you need to back up and think about what do owners want, whether they're public or private. It's basically the same thing. They want a team that is able to generate growing, consistent cash flows over time. And once that cash flow is generated, then how is it deployed in a way that allows that owner to further enhance their ability to generate cash longer term? Once managers understand that, you have the ability to then go through a very disciplined and transparent process that allows for a manager to come to a reality relative to what parts of the business can provide that and what parts of the business cannot.
You need to look at a divestiture as an opportunity, a tool in your toolbox to redeploy capital to where it matters, as well as to redeploy leadership focus to where it matters, right? We don't have endless time or endless focus or an endless ability to manage every project or task in a way that will deliver the right success for our company, for our customers, and for our partners. Approach it in a way where you have the right sense of urgency and focus and with the right talent so that you can achieve that success, both of the business moving on as well as the business staying for reinvestment and future opportunity.
What can companies do to help overcome reluctant attitudes towards divestitures? First and foremost is the tone at the top. The C-suite should be very clear that divestitures are an equally important part of value creation on par with organic growth and acquisitions. Alignment and common understanding across senior management, finance, corporate strategy, and the operating managers as well. Frameworks like total shareholder return models help compare apples to oranges and clarify which parts of the company are dilutive to value creation and others that are accretive. Based on that, the company should create a list of potential divestitures and keep that list updated all the time.
All right, I'd like to now bring on our PwC partners, Mike Nyland and Liz Krigo, into the discussion to share some additional insights from this study. So guys, welcome to the studio. Thanks for joining us. Why is it important for companies to consider divestitures as part of growth strategy in the first place, instead of just concentrating on the acquisitions?
Yeah, John, so divestitures, they create value, right? It's been proven in the marketplace. So companies should naturally be having this as part of their overall strategy. If you look over the past decade, when a company announces a divestiture, their stock price increases by 4% compared to the overall industry index. If you look at the top 25% of those companies, they actually get a double-digit boost on their stock price around the date of announcement. So they're being rewarded by the market. Divestitures, what they allow you to do is it allows you to focus on your core business. It allows you to get back to kind of what your overall strategy is going to be. If you divest a business, you can take those proceeds and you can invest in another business in order to look for those additional kind of growth potentials. And what we also have found out is that companies just aren't the best owner or the right owner for certain type of businesses. And by setting that free, you ultimately are putting it in the hands of somebody else where it can actually perform better. Interestingly, though, what we also found out is that it's not just about doing divestitures. It's also about having acquisitions for growth as part of your business. And those companies that in a given year that do an acquisition as well as a divestiture, they outperform their industry index as well in a 1 and a 2 year period subsequent to doing those type of transactions. So we think it's crucial that companies consider as part of the strategy divestitures as well as acquisitions.
Oh, that's really interesting. So, I know on this study identify one thing that we call the fit, fix, free fallacy. Liz, can you talk a little bit what it is and why it's important?
Absolutely, and it's certainly a tongue twister, if I might say. But the fallacy is really when management identifies a business that doesn't fit their strategy, but they don't make a decision to free it or sell it. They'll maintain the status quo, realizing that they've had a signal that maybe the business doesn't fit with overall strategy. Or even worse, they'll invest time and resources and people and capital to try to fix the business. But we know that that's just kicking the can down the road, and management will probably end up selling the business. And because it doesn't fit, it's at a much lower value. So all of this invested capital that could have been used elsewhere has now been sunken. So in order to not get caught up in the fit, fix, free fallacy, executives really need to recognize that fit signal earlier and take action faster.
Maybe just give us some quick thoughts around what you think around how should they be assessing that fit?
Yep. And it's all part of a rigorous portfolio review process. This should be happening every quarter. There's financial, non-financial data. You look to the future, you look at forecasts, right? But there's some key questions that you should be asking about every single portfolio in your business. And this is all part of, again, the rigorous review process. So questions like, are there synergies that are significant enough to generate an appropriate return? Does the business perform at or above expectations? Does the parent have capabilities that drive differentiated results that gives the business a certain leg up over others in the sector? Or conversely, does the business itself possess things that the parent then values and are leveraged across the parent's organization? But my favorite question, and it's a hard one to answer, is would the investments that have been made in this particular business unit create more value if it were actually invested somewhere else? Really tricky question to answer, but it's one of my favorites.
Well, and it ties into that focus on capital discipline and certainly capital allocation. So Mike, when the research, what gives companies the best chance to create greater value for the shareholders?
Yeah, so when you dive into all the findings, right, and as yourself and kind of Kurt talked about, the survey included 2,500+ respondents, multiple kind of interviews and everything, other type of analytics that we did. The companies that have shown to generate positive TSR, they all have something in common, and it's like what we like to call the winning formula. And there's three things that are part of that formula. One is they're proactive in their portfolio review. Secondly, they have divestitures in their DNA. And third, they act with speed. In fact, the research has shown that for those companies that have all three of those attributes, the probability of a positive TSR is 99.5%. And while this may seem intuitive, what's most interesting, out of the 2,500 respondents, less than 15% of them had these three attributes. So companies, they're looking at trying to get these.
There's clear opportunity here.
Yes.
Clearly this winning formula is a recipe for success, and clearly companies are missing some of the ingredients, and that's opportunity. Liz, can you share some insights on the proactivity and why it's important in divestitures and some ways companies can be proactive?
Absolutely. So our research and our experience shows that quality and thoroughness in companies' portfolio review process really vary considerably. Companies reported, those 2,500 survey respondents were all over the map in terms of their self-reporting versus those deeper questions that we were asking about, well, really, how rigorous is your portfolio review? But we do know that a proactive and comprehensive portfolio review enables executives to recognize that a business doesn't fit and should be sold faster from a position of strength, not from a defensive position where value is low. You sell from a position of strength and you do it quickly. So again, based on our research, a proactive orientation that helps identify business that doesn't fit sooner. So the faster that you recognize the fit signal sooner, right, has been shown to increase the chances of delivering a positive return to shareholders by 5 times for public companies. That is an incredible piece of research that we were able to get from this study. And that's why it's so important, right, for management to be aware of the inertial factors and biases that Kurt was talking about with you earlier to avoid delays in the decision-making process.
That's great. Mike, so what does it mean to have divestitures in your DNA?
Yeah, so a company's DNA, it defines the organization. It defines how it's going to ultimately function. And when we look at divestitures in your DNA, it's, are you willing to consider a divestiture, regardless of whether you ultimately divest and move forward with the transaction? And based on the research, and when we look at the companies that are considered to have divestitures in your DNA, there's various traits that those individuals have. First and foremost, attitude, right? Positive attitudes towards divestitures is critical. I think Kurt and yourself ultimately discussed that only 2/5 of the respondents ultimately said that they ultimately embrace divestitures at the end of the day. Secondly, comprehensive portfolio analysis, right? And we'll talk about what that kind of means, but that's the third one is a reinvestment strategy as part of your initial divestiture strategy. So what are you going to be ultimately doing with the proceeds? And then the last is the board involvement in the portfolio review process.
And I think, interestingly enough, our research shows, right, Mike, that most companies do not have divestitures in their DNA. But companies that do are more willing to consider a divestiture. And that increases their chances of generating greater shareholder returns. And look, here's some stats for everyone, right? But the odds of considering a divestiture increases by 2.5 times if you have a positive attitude towards divestitures. That's just an attitude. And then they're 3.5 times greater when there's an active board in the portfolio review. And then last stat, the likelihood is 65% higher of doing a divestiture when there's a reinvestment plan as part of your initial divestiture strategy.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So, the study also identifies several value traps in divestitures. Mike, can you talk about what they are and give us some examples?
Yeah, and this also gets back to the last part of the winning formula around speed, right? And you need speed throughout the entire process and throughout the entire journey. And we've identified that the faster that you ultimately move, the likelihood of a positive TSR ultimately increases. With that said, and once again, counterintuitive to what happens, 75% of the respondents said that they actually report major delays while doing divestitures. And we looked at what some of those delays are, right? And we kind of broke them up into two different buckets, right? One is really around like, what are the roadblocks of actually getting a deal done? And some of the key items are competing priorities. You have buyer identification and expectations in gaps of purchase price. And the last one, big one, was just the lack of in-house separation expertise.
And I think also, Mike, it's interesting to note that based on survey respondents, the big rocks that created the most delays during the divestiture execution process included tax and legal structuring, business process and separation, system separation, carve-out financial statements, and stranded costs. So executives should really remain aware of these value traps during the deal execution to ensure an appropriate mitigation plan is actually activated to maintain the speed that you need, right? To maintain the optimal deal value and make sure it's captured. All of these value traps, though, it's so interesting because they can all be mitigated by having the right team of advisors. They're all in the control of the company when planned accordingly.
Right, which is what you guys are spending a lot of time doing when we're not here talking about this in the webcast, which is great. So what can executives be doing to avoid the fallacy and increase the odds of generating greater shareholder value?
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about a few things, and these are things that we're currently collaborating, working with our clients on. The first thing is just overcoming the stigma of divestitures. We've talked about the biases. We've talked about how sometimes it gets a negative connotation with it. So it starts with the tone at the top and managing the attitudes at the top. Secondly, which we also talked earlier, was around just doing periodically an objective and thorough review of your portfolios. It's taking the biases out. It's making those type of decisions as well. Thirdly, as Dave Marburger highlighted, it starts with having a clear view of the intrinsic value of the businesses. I can't say enough how important that ultimately is. And then it's developing robust analytics. What we have found from companies, there's two things, right? One, companies just don't have the data necessarily around their different businesses. So it's getting that granular data that you can actually make strategic decisions and make those strategic decisions timely. And then the second part of that is coming up with the analytics that you should be looking at. If you have different type of businesses, you may not should be looking at the same type of analysis or the type of metric. So it's adapting it for that type of business. And then lastly, once you identify that fit signal, you need to have a process in place to act quickly because speed is everything.
That's awesome. And certainly Mike and Liz, thank you guys for joining us today.